Hi, my name is Sean Wildemuth. Welcome back to Coding Shorts. Today we're going to be talking about CSS Animations. You may be using jQuery or other libraries to do your animations, but you don't need to. Let's dig into some CSS to see how it works. Let's get started. So today I want to talk about CSS Animations. I've got a very simple code pen here that does some simple things. I have a couple panels here that can close, and then something like a menu that I can make disappear as well. And while I might want to use something like jQuery to handle this and use some of their animation functions to do this, I think I want to show you that you can do most of this in CSS. So no matter what way you're developing, whether a SPA application, pure JavaScript, whether you're using a SPA application like Angular or Vue, whether you're using vanilla JavaScript to do it all, or even if you're using something like jQuery. If you're using jQuery, you can use the slim version that doesn't have any of the animations, because CSS really does a great job at this. I'm going to talk about it in a few different ways. So let's see what this does at first. First, I just have these close buttons, which make them go away, and I similarly have this sort of collapse button that will hide and show this item. Now, we're not using any animations here. If we look at the JavaScript, we're actually just using display none to make these guys disappear. And the same thing for this menu disappearing and not disappearing, right? We're saying reset the display or display none. Typical way you might make this disappear. I might have opted to use a class here instead, but I wanted to go really raw, just setting some element level styles instead. And I've got some CSS that just makes this look the way it does. I'm not going to really go into what that is. And so there's a few different ways to make animations work in CSS. And the first is something called a transition. So let's start with the first object up here, and we'll see that it's of class box, and it has an ID of first, which is how we're sort of making it work. And so in the box, what I'd like to do is just make the box fade out. And so I can start this with just an opacity, though this is the default opacity of 1 or 100%. This is a floating number from 0 to 1. And so I might have a class here called hide box, and I might put opacity equals 0, right? And so here in my code, instead of setting the style, let's do this using the class instead. Class list dot add hide box, right? And so if we've done this right, when I click this, it should disappear. Notice it didn't change the space it's taking. I've just made it completely transparent, but we'll get to a different way of doing that. Because I am changing this opacity value between here, I can tell the main element that I want you to transition a property in a certain way. And so let's use transition here. And let's say I want to transition opacity using an animation. And I'm going to give it the property, and then I'm going to give it a length of time. And in this case, I'll say 2 seconds, 2s. Now notice I'm not worrying about it being here. I'm basically saying that when the box itself gets changed from its opacity to or from the other opacity, that I'm going to tell it, make that change happen over 2 seconds, transition that property over 2 seconds. And so what happens when we make that change? Now when I say close, it'll slowly fade out. And so transition allows us to do that in a pretty simple way. But in fact, let's make it disappear as well as stop taking space. So let's add to our hide box here, height of 0 as well. Now note that our height here is 145. And so when we change the height to 0, what do we want to do? We want to add another transition property called height, and I'll also make it take 2 seconds, right? So I'm saying animate these in a linear way for this amount of time, and they don't need to be all the same amount of time when I go ahead and click the close, because I'm applying a change to these values. We can see it disappear as well as go smaller. In fact, there's a little bit of magic here that's happening. Let's change our opacity to 1, and let's comment out this overflow hidden, right? Go ahead and tell it to save. Let's go ahead and just rerun this. And when we do this and change the opacity, which we're not actually changing because the value is staying the same, but we're changing the height, what is happening here? The box is getting smaller, but what's inside of it isn't, right? It's showing through, and that's the nature of HTML. This overflow hidden does some of the heavy lifting for us because we're saying if it doesn't exist in the box, I want you to hide anything that flows outside of this box. And this box is the div that holds it, right? It says if any of this stuff doesn't fit in the box, go ahead and hide it. That's one of the options you have. And that will give us that as we make it smaller, it will go ahead and make it disappear. Now, I'm telling you that the height is 0, but a lot of this is because we also have a padding of 4. That's why it doesn't completely disappear, and that's sort of the benefit of making the opacity 0 as well. And when we close it now, it's going to disappear as well as decrease in size. And so we get that nice sort of look and feel of it, even though it is still taking space for the amount of space as that padding. And in fact, let's go down here, because if you know about the box model in HTML, padding plus margin plus size is the actual size of the element. And so let's take this as well. Let's go ahead and say padding. Let's say 2 seconds as well. Now these all don't have to be the same amount of time. It's just common to do that, padding 0. So let's go ahead and add padding here. And I'm going to say 2 seconds, though these could be different times. And let's add padding to 0 here. So when we make it disappear, it should actually disappear and not take any of that space. Make sense? So transitions are one way to do this. Sometimes you want more control than this. And there are options here for using something called easing functions. So I can say ease in here, and there's a whole list of them that tells it, instead of making this change linearly, to actually use a curve to start slow and then speed up at the end is what ease in fact, tells us to do. And I'm going to add this to both of these. So now, it's a little hard to see when it's that fast, but it actually started slower and then sped up, and ease out will do the reverse. So let's change that to out so you can see that as well. See, it speeds up and then slows down at the end. It's a pretty subtle change, but you will see that change in certain things to give you more of that snapness. So for our second box here, I want to be able to have more control over my animations. And so in the JavaScript code, I'm going to actually just here do class list.add. And this time I'm going to add a new one called FancyHide. Now, instead of using hide box, which just changes those values, FancyHide is going to be a little different. So if we come down here, let's go ahead and create our FancyHide. We're going to want to do a couple of things. First, we want to say animation name is, I'm going to use Fancy as our name. And where does this animation name come from? It comes from something called a set of keyframes. And so after the word at keyframes, you're going to give it a name that you're going to be able to use in this animation name. And this is reusable. This can be used a bunch of other places. And the keyframes are a set of stop points for the different values. Now, let's take a step back and remember that animations are just changing values over time. Don't get caught up too much in the way we think about animations in movies and TV. We're really talking about, I want to be able to change something over time. That's really all we did here, was we changed in 2 seconds the opacity of this object and the height of this object. We did it over 2 times from some value to some value. Keyframes allow you to have more than 2 sets of values. Instead of just having a beginning and ending, you're going to also allow yourself to have intermediate values. And it does this by having percentage blocks in here. So I'm going to start with 0%. I'm going to go to 100%. And if I did this, only use these 2, I could use the transition instead. But in our case, I'm going to add a third one at 33%. Now, it could be 50%. It could be 99%. Really up to you. And so in this case, let's just stay with opacity for now. I'm going to say our opacity is going to be 1 when we start. Our opacity is going to be 0 when we stop, just like we thought. But this way I can say the opacity is going to be what when we're 30% done. Let's say we're going to say it's 25%. So it's going to speed over the first 75% rather quickly and then slowly fade into obscurity after that. And so this is going to allow us to do and have more control over this. You can have more than one of these to allow you to do more interesting sort of manipulations. And the last thing we need to do is on FancyHide, we need to give it a duration. Animation, duration, and I'll say 4 seconds so we can really see the change. Oh, we have opacity set. Let's go ahead and see it work. You see it gets faded pretty quickly, and then it goes to that last 25% fairly slowly. But it comes back, and the reason is our FancyHide also needs the ending values. And so if we put opacity 0 here and run it, we'll see that at the end of the 4 seconds, it'll stay invisible. So let's repeat this with height, which I believe we already have in a value here for our box at 145. In this case, height at 33%, I'm going to say 100. And then down here, I'll have height 0. And we'll do the same thing we did before and say padding 4, which is where it starts. And I'll put padding down here at 0 so it knows to make that change as well. Not all of our changes are we're going to want to use that middle section for, but it'll still go from 0 to 100 for us unless we do something specifically at 33%. And to make it go back, of course, we need these as our final values, height and padding, both at 0 as well. And if we've done that right, we should now see it do pretty similar to what it was doing before, but we're having a little bit more control over it. Let's add one more piece, and that is background color. And let's make this white to begin with. And then let's make it go green in an intermediate step. And let's make it go, let's say, a middle gray afterwards. Right? Again, this isn't changing, except we need to change the background color. Though in this case, we don't really need to change this background color. And we don't need to because it's going to be hidden by that point. But it's a good practice to put what the final values are going to be here. So let's go ahead and say close now. See, it turns green and then slowly turns gray as we finish up. And so we can give it a bit of a fit and flourish as we need it to do it. So last example here is this little menu. And I wanted to include this because it has some tricky little pieces that I find interesting. So right now, we're just hiding it or showing it. We're going back and forth between two states. And we're doing that with JavaScript here by just saying on click, we're going to change the text of the button to be right or left, depending on whether we want to expand it. And then we're doing the same thing. We're not using classes in this case to make that different. So instead of using the keyframes, I think we can do this pretty simply with just a transition. So let's go to our menu. Let's just go to the menu and we'll say transition. We're going to say margin left because we're not going to change the properties of the actual object. We're going to change where this exists, right? And so margin left, I'm going to say 1 second and I'll say ease out just so we can make it a little more fancy. So that's our transition, and we're going to need a new, let's call it menu hide, and we'll make our margin left 200, and let's say 65 pixels. Because I believe this is already 250 pixels. Yeah, let's just make, say, 250 pixels. I'm going to actually move it left by saying minus 260 pixels. I'm going to move the whole object over to the left, because our margin to begin with should be 0. So let's change our JavaScript to change this class list.add menu hide, right? Just like we were doing before. I'll do the same thing, but I'm going to remove it so we can see that the transition is going to work in both ways. Of course, when we try it, nothing's going to happen. And that's because an ID overrides the complexity of margin hide. And we could do important here, or I prefer to just go ahead and use the menu to make sure that we're going to get the actual value here, that this will, because this is more specific, CSS tells us that more specific wins. So if we do that, it is moving to the left, but it's actually covering up our button. We should be able to click it to come back. And the reason is, if we look at our HTML, we're moving this inside this container, but our menu container, unsurprisingly, if we have a style for menu container, we don't. Let's go ahead and add one. Dot menu container, we're going to say overflow hidden. Now, why is that? We'll see that in the HTML that we have this container so that when this moves outside of the view of the actual menu, that it should disappear. And because we've said hidden, it won't override this. It'll effectively create this little window. overflow hidden actually creates a little window so that as you move things, they won't end up outside the container or really clip when they get to the container, if that makes sense. So if I do this now, we'd see it disappear and reappear. And so we can have that behavior we want of like hiding and showing a menu. But don't ever forget this little hidden trick of using overflow to really have that happen. And because we're using a transition in this state, we're saying when margin left changes, change it for 1 second and use ease out to do it, no matter what it's changing to and from. So that means that this is being used when we change it by adding the menu and when we complete the menu. In fact, if we click it in the middle, we automatically get that behavior of it knowing that we need to reverse the item. And so we don't get that weird behavior of the animation has to complete before the button is ready and all of that other behavior. Hope this is giving you a clue that you don't need to use fancy little tricks and libraries to do animations when you have full control over animations directly in the CSS, just by adding and removing classes or other selectors to your objects. This again has been Sean Wildermuth for Coding Shorts. Thanks for joining me.